Not a day goes by we don't hear about yet another cybersecurity attack, it seems, with companies big and small hit with malware, malicious software, there's phishing scams, a damaging ransomware attack. So are things getting worse, or does it just seem that way? Well, I know many of our listeners run a company or work in IT for an organization, so you're in for a fascinating discussion on the topic of cyber risk with the leaders in this space, BitSight. We're joined by Chief Technical Officer Stephen Boyer, as well as Anders Norremo. He is CEO at Third Party Trust. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Hey, glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephen, let's start with you. Please give us a bit of a BitSight 101, if you will. What's the company all about?
Yeah, BitSight is a cybersecurity ratings and analytics firm. We are very similar to, think of like a credit score or a credit rating on a company from their financial side. We do that from the cybersecurity side. So we take data and measurement and rate organizations on their cybersecurity performance and look at the risks that may come with that ultimately translate to dollars or euros, so organizations can make better data-driven decisions based on cyber risk.
Yeah, I love that you quantify a company's cyber risk, this numerical score like a credit rating.
Yes, and it makes it easier to understand. What we really try to do is democratize cyber risk so business leaders who may not be cybersecurity experts can understand it and make decisions. So if I were to tell my grandma this organization is an 800, she understands roughly what that means because she's been tracking her credit scores and she knows,
Right.
An 800 is actually high performing.
Got it. All right. Awesome. With that in mind, can you give us your take on the current cybersecurity landscape in terms of cyber risk? And has that state of cyber risk changed, as I alluded to in my introduction?
Well, I think your intro captured it, and the frequency of the stories tells you a little bit about what's going on. I was just doing as preparation from this, and I just saw some farm organizations just got hit with some ransomware over the last little while. These aren't banks and the typical groups you would think about. I mean, these are groups that are helping farmers produce crops. So I would say the breadth and scope of the threat has continued to grow at the same time that we've benefited from all of these digital services. And so the digital services have expanded, but the threat continues to expand with it. And so the state of cybersecurity is we are spending more than we ever have before. And in many ways, the outcomes are worse than they ever have been before. Now we're benefiting, right, from all the great services and apps and technologies that we have. But what we also have is attackers and bad actors who are taking advantage of many of the weaknesses that exist in our system.
Yeah, no doubt that they're exploiting these weaknesses. And certainly since the start of the pandemic, we've seen a huge spike, a huge uptick in attacks across the board. So Anders, tell us a bit about Third Party Trust, your company. And are there any trends you've noticed in the types of events that we've seen over the past couple of years?
Sure, Mark. Yeah. So Third Party Trust, we're a technology company. We help our customers better manage risk around third parties. Well, how do we do that? We allow them in a very scalable fashion to understand, the inside operations of every single one of their third parties, and then allow them to look across the entire spectrum. Where do they have the risk in their third party ecosystem?
And when you talk about third parties, Anders, I just want to clarify to our listeners, it's like I run a bank in the Midwest and I want to outsource my HR or payroll to a company instead of handling it in-house. Your work with BitSight will help provide a snapshot as to the risk associated with working with that third party. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You mentioned HR systems. So SaaS or technology solutions are obvious third parties. Then you have some that are not so obvious that still have an incredible amount of sensitive data, like law firms, for example. And there's, in the past, if you think about the Panama Papers, and there's many more, law firms sit on very sensitive data. So third-party risk really just means that you're engaging with another company, a third party, and you're sharing non-public information. As soon as you share that information, that could be access or data, as soon as you share that, risk basically exists in that relationship, and you need to manage that risk. That's what third-party risk management is all about.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, we partner closely with BitSight. Again, we focus more on, asking the questions, getting attestations, understanding how they're certified. And together we feel like it's a great way to approach this problem in a scalable fashion for our joint customers. Now, in terms of the recent attacks, like what's been eye-opening is just the way they ended up affecting just so many companies, right? So look at SolarWinds, for example. The initial estimate was around 18,000 customers. And then they researched it, they looked at it, and they downgraded to quote unquote only 100 customers. That's still, one breach, huge amount of impact. Moving to the Kaseya breach, right? So that one impacted at least 800 companies downstream, if not many, many more. The trend that I'm seeing is, this contagion effect to the recent breaches. It really stands out to me. It's something that, we didn't see much before as we're doing now.
Stephen, why do you think there is such a disconnect, it seems, between companies that are getting breached and the cybersecurity landscape as a whole? I mean, you would think companies like SolarWinds, like Anders said, and Kaseya, and more recently Fortinet, that these victims of some of the major ransomware attacks that we've witnessed lately, that they would understand the importance of cyber risk. But then these major leaks or breaches or attacks, they still happen.
I always want to be very careful to avoid doing what we call blaming the victim, right? So I think many of these organizations are trying to do their very best and to try to protect their systems. And you do have a pretty sophisticated, motivated adversary, right? And so they are looking to exploit any gap or weakness. What you do have is tremendous growth in complexity. When you think about game changers in the last little while, what we saw over the last year and a half with the pandemic and businesses adapting to it is just a huge digital transformation, or what was been called by McKinsey the great digital acceleration, where there were 5 years of digital transformation in just a few short months. And so when you're doing that, you're adding complexity and you're opening up the exposure, you're using more third parties, you're deploying new systems, it's opening you up and it's opening up your attack surface to more adversaries. And so that complexity and the dynamic nature of cyber and information systems makes it very hard to be perfect. An attacker really only has to get through one door or one window to exploit you. And so you're dealing with this complexity and this dynamic system that's very hard to be, perfect in your protections. One thing that people are really challenged with is where to prioritize. And this is where we're getting to this conversation about managing cyber risk. There are groups that have tried to do it all and tried to do it all equally, as opposed to really focusing on the key areas that are the largest business risk. And that's where we think being able to understand where those risks are, quantify that and say, hey, we're going to focus our efforts here because we can't be perfect, but we're going to invest in these particular areas to minimize our cybersecurity risk. So yes, the incidents continue to go up, in part because you have a very, very motivated adversary, especially one who's monetizing ransomware, just a huge clip. And then groups that are dealing with this complexity that's super hard to manage consistently every day.
All great points, Stephen. Thank you. We're chatting with Stephen Boyer, Chief Technical Officer at BitSight. We also have on the line Anders Norremo. He is CEO at Third Party Trust, a software company and an integrator. They also work with BitSight to help companies assess their third-party cyber risk as well. Now, Anders, there is so much attention on cybersecurity these days, as we've been chatting about, but also when it comes to policy and in business. So, for example, Biden's push for more stringent cybersecurity safeguards across the board, and a plea to other G7 countries to hold hackers accountable. We'll see where that goes. But there's also Apple's announced program to drive continuous security improvements through the supply chain. There's Google's financial commitment to expand zero trust programs, Microsoft, Amazon, and others. So what seems to be influencing these decisions on cyber risk strategy across industries? And in your opinion, what should be influencing a business's cyber risk strategy?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a couple of things come to mind in terms of what has changed for companies and their approach to cybersecurity. So regulation has definitely been a catalyst of change. The past 4 years, during that administration, there was very little federal regulation, but what we saw happen was really the states stepped in. California and New York, they were leading the charge. And then also, like many other enacted cybersecurity and privacy regulations, South Carolina, Texas, et cetera. Right? So going forward, I would predict we're going to continue to see kind of federal government enacting more stringent regulation when it comes to cyber, especially, anyone that's selling goods and services directly or indirectly to the federal government. There's going to be a lot more regulation in the future there. Mm-hmm. We also saw industries self-imposing regulations to strengthen their security posture. Energy, did a great job of really getting their arms around it. Another area, cyber insurance industry, they're changing their approach also, right? They're shifting some of the risk back to the businesses, meaning the coverage they're writing is not as broad as it used to be. that's changing behavior as well. So those are all reasons kind of like what I've seen. Now, what I think should be changing the approach, in my opinion, it would be the need to mitigate the risk to companies, avoid business disruption, and safeguard the reputations. Right. And if I compare like an established industry process like supply chain management, and most companies are highly sophisticated. They know every detail and they can manage and adapt rapidly to avoid complications. When it comes to cyber, I think we'll get there. It's just going to take a while.
Stephen?
Well, we've also seen, in addition to some of these investments from the private sector, is also interest from investors. Investors want to understand what are the risks when they're making an investment, and what could go wrong with that investment if there is a cybersecurity incident that has financial impact that's material. So we just had a recent announcement and a deep partnership with Moody's to try to bring cybersecurity risk and data into credit ratings and to bring that into how investors are thinking about the investments. There's also another partnership with a company called Glass Lewis, who may not be a household name, but they're the world's leading proxy advisory firm, which is advising investors on how to vote on board initiatives and board seats. And so they are bringing now cybersecurity into that area of advisory when they're helping people vote on different initiatives. And so cybersecurity is starting to impact business in very different ways than it ever has before. A lot of people just think about breach, but an organization with poor governance, although they may not have faced breach, may still have issues where investors are going to demand changes. Could be different board composition, could be different investment profiles, because they see investment risk in the company from their cybersecurity performance and governance standpoint.
Yeah, good point. Thank you for sharing that, Stephen. And Stephen, there has been a lot of talk these days about the supply chain. This seems to impact everybody, even customers, consumers waiting for packages to arrive, or appliances or vehicles arriving to purchase. So obviously, there's a lot of reasons for these issues today: COVID and cargo ship challenges, to chip shortages, and truck driver strikes, and there's a lot of other issues going on. And there's also growing cyber risk on the supply chain. We hear a lot about this notion of supply chain resilience. What does that mean exactly, Stephen? And are the changes and investments that I previously mentioned enough to help?
Yes, really a couple of parts to that. One, is the supply chain impacted from a cybersecurity standpoint? And I'll just use a couple of recent examples here. One, there's one of the world's largest meat packing companies called JBS was impacted by a ransomware attack. And that impacted their ability to distribute meat to the planet, to feed humans. Right. So yes, some of us may be annoyed because we can't order our laptop because some of the chip shortages, but you can imagine what could happen over long periods of time when we can't get food to feed our population. The second was a Colonial Pipeline, which was a gas distributor that supplied a lot of the gas to the Eastern Seaboard. So you think about that, that's impacting human lives from a cybersecurity incident. And they were offline for a period and ultimately decided to pay the ransom to get back online. And so you start to think these are real world impacts. This isn't just somebody having their social security number out on the dark web. This is the ability to feed our population and keep people warm, or allow them to cook and use their utilities.
Yeah, I know those are two examples of the biggest ransomware attacks in the country this year. And I remember all the images coming out of New York of people trying to fill up their vehicles with gas during all this. So scary time.
Yes. So you imagine, okay, well, that's certainly impacting people's lives, and you can call that the supply chain, or you can call it suppliers, but they are in key vendors in the way that we operate our economy. The resilience aspect is really trying to get to this notion of, I am going to know that I'm not going to be perfect, and I should anticipate issues. I should anticipate outages. And so I need to manage that risk in a way that I can either be assured that someone's going to have a better response, or that I have some sort of backup or alternatives. And so the resilience piece is just trying to think about, it's not supply chain perfection, right? It's really supply chain resilience, which now I'm building programs. I'm thinking about this from a portfolio perspective. I'm trying to come up with alternatives or approaches, contracts, insurance, et cetera, that's going to help me battle through a negative incident. And so that's where people are talking about, we've conceded that there's no such thing as complete cybersecurity, only cybersecurity risk that needs to be managed. And so when you're talking about supply chain resilience, you're managing that risk in a way that you are trying to onboard in a way that makes sense. You're trying to require certain levels of controls. You're following up with the vendor to make sure, or the supply chain partner to make sure that they're keeping up with different things. You're monitoring that situation over time, and you're building a risk program to report and show progress against those investments. And so this is where we see just a maturation of supply chain risk to include cybersecurity risk, because it's just become more important.
Very interesting. Thank you, Stephen. All right, I'm going to ask both of you our final question. Anders, we'll start with you. What advice would you give to someone who's looking to start a career in cybersecurity today?
Sure. If you're young and you're kind of picking a career to go forward, I mean, I would just encourage you to, at your high school, at your college, what's a curriculum around cybersecurity? What courses do they offer? Right. I don't see this problem going away anytime soon. So there's going to be a high demand of talent in the industry for decades to come.
Yeah, no doubt.
And if someone is looking to retool and change career paths, it's a number of certifications that you can study for. Just one example would be to become a pen tester, right? Many of them are really hands-on. They provide great experience. And, a second option would be to attend, cybersecurity boot camp, right? They're similar to coding boot camps that we saw over the last decade that were really successful in upskilling folks.
Oh, wow. That's cool. I didn't realize that there were boot camps to help upskill or reskill folks for cybersecurity. Stephen, same question to you. Any advice that you'd give to someone thinking about starting a career in cybersecurity? Good idea?
Yes, I think it's a very good idea. And here's why. There are projected millions of open positions in this area. And everyone who's written about it and read about it realizes that there's just a huge short of people with the skills and interest level. And when I talk with people who are either starting out their careers or who are wondering what they want to do next, I always offer up, obviously I'm super biased, but have you thought about cybersecurity? And it's not just reserved for the nerd who's a computer hacker who just loves computers. It's pretty broad. And there are lots of different opportunities to get involved and to just understand what are the different roles and aspects that you could participate in. And you do not have to be an expert to start getting involved. You can start looking at what the different roles and positions that are out there. And then there's a lot of free content from YouTube videos to training. Anders mentioned the boot camps. There's just a lot of content to learn. Is this something that you would be interested and passionate about? Because it just really takes that curiosity and a little bit of passion. And there are plenty of opportunities. And a lot of organizations are taking people who are not experts with zero experience and training them up. And they're just saying, hey, we're going to go build this workforce of the future. So I'd say take advantage of those openings, those programs that will train you up, and a lot of free content because the opportunities are there.
All right. And then speaking of a lot of content, BitSight.com is a great resource. You have a lot of different sections there for our listeners to learn more about the organization and your work. And Anders, thirdpartytrust.com is the best place to go to learn about your company as well, correct?
Correct. You got it.
All right. Stephen Boyer and Anders Norremo, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your insight, your expertise. It's a fascinating discussion. And certainly we're going to be chatting about cyber risk and cyber attacks for the months and years to come. Love to have you back on the show another time. Thanks again.
Likewise. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.